Buenas noches a todos. Soy Daniel Morena, nuevo director del Círculo Molinari, y tengo hoy conmigo a Tho Bishop. Tho Bishop es editor y responsable de contenidos en el Mises Institute en Alabama. Antes de trabajar para el Mises Institute, fue subdirector de comunicaciones del Comité de Servicios Financieros de la Cámara de Representantes en Washington. Es presidente del Partido Republicano en su condado, desde donde organiza a los votantes para lograr victorias electorales a nivel estatal y local. Desde ese cargo ha trabajado para establecer conexiones en todos los niveles y encontrar maneras de conseguir avances significativos, aunque sean marginales. Welcome, Tho, to the Círculo Molinari, a Spanish Institute of Political Philosophy, inspired by and deeply admiring the work of the Mises Institute in Alabama. We are delighted to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the first question that I want to talk with you is that about President Andrew Jackson. Many on the populist right have looked to President Andrew Jackson as a political model. Yet Jackson was a Democrat who seemed to believe in universal suffrage, which arguably helped undermine his own reforms in the long run. Do you still see Jackson as a figure worth emulating today? And if so, in what ways?
So I think Jackson is an important American figure to grapple with, in part because I think if you're looking for the political tradition that delivered the best victories for libertarianism, classical liberalism, call it what you will, that the Jacksonian tradition was the best in the American context. Now, part of that was, he was a figure uniquely situated because he was a national hero. He was a big celebrity type figure. He was, and so he benefited from the transition towards popular sovereignty that pre-existed his political rise. So the two of those helped hand in hand. But I think particularly given that we live in such a system, right, the idea of restricting the franchise would be something that I think would be extremely radical, which I think is, which not that I'm against radical solutions, but I think within the system as it exists,
Yes.
I think that required a complete overthrowing the system, in which case you have different questions. But I think what made the Jacksonian successful was a few aspects that can be replicated today. One of that was a very strong political organization. That's where the party building of Martin Van Buren is very big there. That party building required reaching out to normal folks, getting them organized, having their own parallel information systems, right? So the rise of newspapers and the popular communication there, all of which I think we're seeing in major forms today. With alternative medias and things like that, breaking away the control of the information news gathering system. But it was also deeply wound in a populist understanding of sound economics. So there was significant outreach around the question of hard currency, condemnation of central banking, the cronyism that came with it, the moral arguments of the time, even questions of tariffs and the way that was very deeply wound in the workers' parties of New York. The New York political establishment was very interesting for quite some time as being very libertarian in many ways, which is difficult to imagine today. And he was also he was a macho figure of action. He was a very masculine figure, which I think in today's world, right, American conservatives, they're, there's people like the imagery of like a Teddy Roosevelt, or you see it with Trump memes today, right? I think Jackson is a figure that can capture that sort of imagery there for memes and things like that, which I think are important. But it's also the willingness of using executive power that I think separated his successes versus, say, the Jeffersonians. I think the idea that the legislature is somehow going to result in more liberal outcomes is something that has not held up over time. I think maybe there's some political systems where that can be argued. In the American system, I do not believe that is the case. And so it was precisely his willingness to be very strong-handed as an executive for libertarian ends that made his, I think, that tree a lot more successful than, say, the Jeffersonians that came before it. And I think that those are all aspects that have very real value in trying to navigate the American political sphere in particular, but also invite questions that can be broadly applicable. I think that's why Murray Rothbard found him such a fascinating figure. Patrick Newman had a great talk at our research conference this year about Jackson's executive strategy and things like that. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the successes that he had, particularly when you compare them to the Jeffersonians or other attempts that had similar ideas at the core of the philosophy, but did not manifest itself in the sort of meaningful victories when it came to actually wielding political power in a way that took power away from the regime itself.
Okay, yes. But for example, I mean, one thing that you said is that the executive power was strong at this moment. Personally, I agree with being something like libertarian or paleolibertarian, and also calling for more executive power. For example, Eric von Quenel-Ledin talked about the monarchies, and also he defended military dictatorships because he says that the measures inside could be more libertarian. So it's not it's something that is not directly contrary. And other question that I have is that what are your views on secession and the legacy of Confederacy? Do you think there is anything libertarians or conservatives today can learn from that historical experience? And also, how do you view the era of segregation and figures like George Wallace, perhaps the first modern Southern populist leader?
So there's a lot there. I think secession is ultimately what true libertarian victory looks like, right? The political decentralization has a number of benefits, and it's true well beyond the Civil War example. I think that's a focus that you find deeply within Mises's political work, Rothbard's political work. Ryan McMakin, our executive editor, has a wonderful article about how, because people make a big deal, right, about how Rothbard was an anarchist, Mises was a minarchist. Therefore, there are inherent contradictions within these views. And certainly there are some areas of disagreements that the two scholars had politically, but ultimately, if one I think there is a lot to be said about radical decentralization, even with minarchist states, do bear a lot of what Rothbard was advocating within his anarcho-capitalist framework that has value there. So his work in particular, which also continued with his book on secession called Breaking Away, has a lot of great material on the value of smaller polities, greater diversity within that. So that you can have a lot of different models of governance out there and giving people the option to vote with their feet, if you will. Now, when it comes to the particular example of the Civil War, I think part of the big relevance there, the reason why it's something that continues to be a topic of discussion, is ultimately people trying to figure out what went wrong with the American constitutional framework. Right, that how did we get the current American empire today versus what was promised to the American people and that we ratified within the Constitution and things like that. And I think it's very clear that you can look at the Civil War as one of several turning points in the submission of the states to federal executive rule. Andrew Jackson was not a big fan of secession unalification, so him and Lincoln probably been very similar on their unionist views there. So do with that what you will. History can be very complex in that regard. But I think that it is valuable to separate the question of secession, the right of Southern secession, in that war and a kind of celebration of the Confederacy itself, which is something I can see, I see often kind of oversimplified, right? Simply because the South should have had the right to leave the Union does not mean that the Confederacy was therefore a more libertarian regime than the North, for example. There's a lot of great analysis. I think Mark Thornton has written about this. Chris Calton, who's a historian, who's now with the Independent Institute, but was a summer fellow with us, has done a lot of good work on the economics of the Confederacy and how it was even a more interventionist economy than the North was. So some of the domestic policies, if you will. Now, obviously, that was a state that emerged within the context of war. War always creates the conditions for greater intervention.
Yes.
We can argue that there's good arguments to be made how that is detrimental to that cause, but it's a natural occurrence there. And so maybe you could perhaps argue like, oh well, if the South had emerged independent after the Civil War, it would have had a better government than the North. Whatever. I mean, that's you can try to make that argument, but knowing what we know now is that the Confederacy itself had plenty of issues with the way that it governed, many of which weakened the state of the Confederacy and played a role in perhaps its military outcomes. And I think this point is very important for within the current conversations in the American right, because you will see a lot of people associated with organizations like in the National Conservative Movement that have this sort of basic understanding that the South was driven by Jeffersonian libertarian economic views. The North was dominated by the mercantilism of Alexander Hamilton. When the two came into conflict, the Hamiltonian North conquered the Jeffersonian South. And therefore, if we as a nation do not want to be conquered, we should be more like the Hamiltonian North and less like the Jeffersonian South. And the irony of that is, for one, just it's a compelling historical narrative. It's just very simple and very wrong. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, the North was actually very laissez-faire in many of its views. Like the advocacy for free trade, for example, there were a lot of major advocates within the working class party of the North, even though a lot of its political leaders desired protectionism for industrial purposes there. And the South had a lot of its own economic interventions, even if it was against tariffs, right? So that narrative is actually extremely simplistic in ways that just give you a bad narrative unless you're just trying to ration away your desire for tariffs there. And so I think that's what makes this moment and the kind of the nuances of the different political territories there very interesting and continues to have some relevance here. But I think the question of secession itself is very distinct from just the questions of that particular dynamic there. And to your last point about Southern populism, I think there's a number of very interesting figures of the Southern populist tradition. George Wallace obviously was a major figure within Alabama, but there were others. Lester Maddox was a governor from Georgia who was very much opposed to federal forced integration, very much opposed to the Civil Rights Act, but was a lot more laissez-faire in sort of economic views. George Wallace was, obviously very was definitely much more of an economic interventionist within Alabama. He had a very interesting debate with Bill Buckley at one point, which I highly recommend anyone interested in that era to check out. And Wallace was making the argument that you're calling me a racist. The reason why a lot of our state programs that we created that were being criticized, understandably so, on economic grounds, were the necessary. Those were efforts made to take care of elderly Black Alabamans whose kids had moved to the North to Detroit and Chicago for economic reasons. And so, you're calling me a racist, but our programs are dedicated to fixing this problem. Now, again, there's problems that come with that building of the social welfare state at the state level, but there's a lot more interesting dynamics. I mean, Louisiana has a very interesting flavor of its own when it comes to Southern populism, the Huey Long example, and things like that. And I think what's fascinating is throughout the South itself is the combination with the scars of the civil rights of the Civil War, where you had so much economic destruction resulting from the war itself. You had Reconstructionism that was imperial control over these states for quite some time, with a political class that was given control over these territories that had no respect for the domestic populations there. A lot of Yankees, for example, being able to come down as carpetbaggers and control these territories on the service of the Republican Party at the time. You had it being deprived of railroads and other sort of federal investments and the like. And so those were economic scars that were that still play out today. And so that Southern populist backlash was directly the response to the way the South was treated during and after the Civil War, in ways that each one of them has their own sort of distinct flavors based off of the particular conditions of the states. And so it just goes to kind of the interesting things that pop up when you have this very much us against the world sort of mentality within modern politics, and the differences between how the different ideological influences with those commonalities can present themselves out. Georgia, for example, much better off than Alabama in many ways. And again, I think there's certain aspects to where the economic ideologies of these populist leaders plays a role in that.
Okay, interesting answer of everything. I have another question about other topic. In general, why do you believe libertarianism should be understood as a right-wing rather than a centrist or left-wing philosophy, as Paleolibertarians understood? Because historically, all major libertarians, political figures, for example, from Ron Paul and Thomas Massey now in the US, to Janusz Korwin-Mikke in Poland, Javier Milei in Argentina, or now Johannes Kaiser in Chile, have come from the so-called far right. What do you think explains this pattern?
Well, I think that I very much am a prescriber of thin libertarianism when it comes to understanding. I have a very thin view of libertarianism itself. I think you can have left libertarians. I think you can have right libertarians. You probably could even have a center, if you will, though I think it's a little more difficult to really, I think that's kind of avoids some of the underlying questions there than perhaps is a distinct trend itself. I think that the reason for why political success tends to come from the right over the left, that if we define left and right, which is a constant struggle, I tend to appreciate, I believe it's Paul Godfrey, among others, distinguishing left and right based off of the respect for natural hierarchy. Hierarchy versus egalitarianism.
I agree.
And so, from that standpoint, I think that if we imagine libertarianism as a restriction of political influence, and therefore having political organization with society replaced by natural hierarchy, right? A greater place for the church, a greater place for family, a greater place for ethnic preferences, religious preferences, the way that human beings operate if left alone, greater reliance upon social trust, all of those aspects, I think, are right-wing in nature, and then libertarianism simply is a modifier of the proper use of the state in those societies. Whereas if you are, kind of an egalitarian, you want all lifestyles treated the same. You want the kind of abolishment of discrimination. You want the you see no difference between you see no difference if you have a neighborhood that consists of 50 different people from 50 different places in the world, right, that lack those pre-political bonds, right? I think that's just very difficult to have play out in reality. I think the constituency for that is very little. I think that is very utopian in its nature. I think it typically ends up with an over-reliance upon sort of a Marxist left-wing destroy. You end up aligning with people that want to destroy, I think, the fabric of society itself, which typically do not appreciate the virtues of the market, and you will. And I think to the best extent possible, if you're going to have such a society, it'd be, if you're going to have a society that is where our ties amongst each other are purely determined by the market, then I think that you would not have that arise through a political society, right? It would not arise from political coalitions. It would not arise from from politics of getting the popular man behind you, of populist politics and like. You would at best, and I think this is very viable, and maybe this gets a little bit closer to the central component, kind of a central libertarian perspective to it, is that such a society that is where our only tie is economic would almost necessarily, in my opinion, be a startup society. It'd be an entrepreneurial vision. It would be a free city, right? It would be something like Prospera in Honduras, or some of these other attempts, seasteading, which was a very big trend a couple of years ago, right? The idea that, someone buys sovereignty over a territory. You have an opt-in society of libertarians that, they don't care. There is no religious test. There is no ethnic test. There is no pre-political assumption outside of a desire to seek out this sort of arrangement. So there'd be some sort of bias, if you will, if people desiring an explicitly libertarian political entity, or at least seek the benefits of a libertarian political entity, and therefore you can opt into this private society. Maybe that is something that could be dubbed left. Maybe that is something that could be dubbed as center, if you will. That could be something that would be not of the right, if you will. You would have kind of, because of that opt-in component to it, you really kind of would have perhaps a greater collection of equals, if you will, because assumably you would have certain sort of financial barriers in order to get in here, right? They're not going to let just some random person on the street. Now, that does create some interesting questions about how such a society would handle its borders and migration and things like that. And people typically of the left libertarian variety probably would not like the reality that would come from that. Neither here nor there. I'm not trying to take any cheap shots. I'm just trying to be as analytical as possible there. I think that is, so I think from a political standpoint, the way of activating a large enough political entity, or a large enough movement that can have political support, I think would have to be making appeals to pre-political connections, and therefore would be right-wing in nature. I think that opportunities that are separate from that will require an entrepreneurial bent, and therefore culture and natural hierarchy is less important because it is a purely opt-in environment there. Again, I want to see as much experimentation, and I welcome as much strategy and attempts at libertarian victory around the world as possible there. But from my own beliefs and just from my own experiences and my own understanding of history, some of which you've identified there, I tend to think that politically, libertarianism is at its best as a right-wing, as with right-wing strategy there. And also, I think that at the end of the day, libertarianism is at its best when we're not trying to have some sort of unified liberty movement independent of everywhere else. I think that libertarianism has always been at its most potent when it is guiding policy. It is solving solutions, really going to the question of who do we want as our neighbor. And like, I don't care how much, there are a lot of people who I'd rather have as my neighbor who've never read a Rothbard book than a lot of people that have read Rothbard. And so when it actually comes to like, what is the society we want to live in? I think that's a question that is often more important than the books that we read. I just want the people that read the right books to have influence on what the political entity around us looks like.
That's good answer. Okay, so let's go to political strategy. I have a question about, obviously, Ron Paul. So the question is, how can libertarians effectively influence the Republican Party? Because Ron Paul's campaigns seem to awaken a libertarian current within the Republican Party, especially among younger voters. Do you think that momentum can be revived today? What kind of networks or institutions need to be built to make libertarian ideas more influential within the party? And do you see hope in figures like Thomas Massie, Mike Lee, or even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have taken non-interventionist positions and have occasionally showed ideas such as end the Fed as potential carriers of that legacy?
Well, I do think the Ron Paul political movement continues to be extremely influential. I think if you were to look at your average Trump staffer in his 30s, a lot of them, the majority of them, probably were Ron Paul fans, in part because the Ron Paul was the most popular candidate when those guys were 18, 19, 20 years old. And so I think we have seen major changes in, again, the way the Fed is viewed, the way that foreign wars are viewed, the way that Department of Education is viewed, right? The MAGA movement, the Trump movement is grounded in great suspicion of political institutions. And therefore, a lot of those libertarian, the Ron Paul era messages, benefit from that. Now, where we have seen the fewer gains made politically is on the question of economics. And I think you've seen, obviously, greater interest in industrial policy, greater interest in trade restrictions, greater interest in a number of fronts there. And I think that part of that is the consequence that a lot of the leading institutions in DC dedicated for defending capitalism, free enterprise, laissez-faire, whatever, libertarianism, whatever you call it, you will, had a cultural, always had a left-wing cultural bias. I think it did not appreciate, for one, I think a lot of those institutions had a blind spot when it came to the Fed, in particular, the Federal Reserve in particular, right? The Wall Street Journal, American Enterprise Institute, all these organizations. I mean, even Cato, right? The Cato Institute, which is supposed to be a libertarian think tank, right, was having Ben Bernanke in and giving them prizes, right? There's always been a bit of a difference. It was broadly seen by people that were nominally free market that the Fed, the American Fed, was a net positive entity. It changed a little bit after 2008, 2009. But even there, the desire has been kind of modest reforms, which are very difficult to do. And so therefore, if you do not appreciate the extent to which, if you're arguing for, if you're defending the Fed while also while advocating free trade, advocating for all various policies that benefit big business, then you are advocating for policies that end up having the effect of further consolidating power in the aspects of the economy that are closest to power, right? So big businesses get bigger, middle businesses get squeezed, right? And then you particularly add, right, other aspects of the regime that these same think tanks would have criticized, right? Regulatory state, whatever, there's plenty of stuff, American economic policy was certainly not libertarian, right? Prior, at any point, no matter what you might hear from a J.D. Vance or certain aspects of the national conservative movement today. But it's just in particular, if you ignore the Fed, then a lot of your criticisms today are going to be missing a major piece. And so it's understandable why they won't take you seriously. And so I think there was a credibility crisis that libertarians create again, and then you see the arrogant, again, like the conflation of government, pushing gay marriage, as a government creation across the country. You see the sneering at people concerned about immigration policy. You see this very antagonistic air that is not necessarily reflected in the economic institutions per se, but certainly from like Reason Magazine and Cato and a lot of these libertarian think tanks. That I'm not surprised that the libertarian label has lost a lot of its cachet over time, and whereas populist, right-wing populism has been on the rise. And so I think it's a failing of libertarianism and people that defend economic capitalism, particularly at the national level there. So to your point about some of the leaders in today's world, I'm a big fan of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think she's best member of Congress. I think Mike Lee is a very good senator. I think Rand Paul is very frustrating. He's very disappointing, I think, at times. I think some of the battles he takes makes no sense. He undermined an attempt at an improvement at healthcare reform back in 2018, which I think was a bad vote. I think that he has not used his position in a way that his father would have in terms of advocating ideas. And I think he can have a very snarky sort of persona at times, which I think is understandable, right? I mean, there's a lot of stupidity in Washington. I get wanting to be snotty. I get wanting to be arrogant. I get, being very critical of Trump, right? Like all that makes, a lot of good justifications for all of that. But if your goal is to influence this movement in your direction, the battles that you pick are important. Thomas Massey, for example, was a much more effective congressman than Justin Amash, because Justin Amash attacked Trump over Russiagate and FBI and the FBI narrative there, right, where Massey defended him. And so even though they voted similarly on policies, Massey was good in Trump world until he wasn't of late. That's another thing. And Amash was thrown out, right? So there's ways of playing your hand. I mean Ron Paul was very good at navigating his environment. He never lost an election after he became a member of Congress, in spite of being the most radical, boldest voice out there, even during the War on Terror years. And so he knew the way to the ideas to emphasize his, when he was, before he ran to Congress, when he came back to Congress in the 90s, he was doing a lot of cultural commentary that spoke to the people that were the most distrustful of DC. And so I think that when it comes to, if we recognize politics for what it is, and politics requires having support, and politics requires coalitions, then the question is, how do you play the coalition game in a way that is going to achieve outcomes? What outcomes are out there that are politically advantageous that we can get votes for to achieve it? And if you're not doing that, then why are you in politics, right? I think the idea that politics should simply narrowly be, I think that we should strive to identify and achieve gains in the margins if you're going to be in that seat. And so some examples are that, like, the one major, the most exciting aspect in America, and I think throughout the world, when it comes to libertarian economic policy, is Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and the like, right? What I would love to see is the taxes eliminated on gold, silver, Bitcoin, and the rest. We could have achieved that during a tax plan proposal, right? You say, if you want my vote, you're going to do my one thing. My one thing is eliminating this particular tax. There's going to be plenty within that bill that I'm not going to like, right? It's going to spend too much, whatever. But if you do that one thing, then you allow people to escape from the Federal Reserve. You allow people to escape from socialized dollars and save in private assets. That would have been a major victory, right? These are things that can be achieved, but the question is, do you want to, are you willing to make a deal to get your outcomes desired? And I get why it's difficult, right? Again, politics is full of crap. Most things that happen in government are awful. Most of them are detrimental to liberty. They happen regardless of how libertarians vote most of the time, right? So the question is, where can you use your leverage if you're in those positions to make steps in the right direction? So like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, they voted against war powers for the president in spite of being very big Trump supporters and the like. So we've definitely seen, I think, a lot of interesting political alliances. I think there's a lot more members of Congress that libertarians can find things to cheer about than there were when Ron Paul was one of the very few that had positive things. I think we've definitely grown in influence. We don't have a Ron Paul figure right now who was so great at so many things. Massey's probably the next best within that, but we don't have that same sort of. If he was to run for president, would he have a similar impact as Ron Paul would as that national figure? Maybe. I would love to see that. I would love to see an attempt there. But it is this broader question about how should libertarians act when they are in a legislature that I think is a very difficult and a question that I've not seen very well answered in practice. But hopefully we'll find some gains down the road.
Sorry that I was muted. Okay, no, it's an interesting answer. For example, when I published the things that we liked in Círculo Molinari, I published one photo of Thomas Massey with his family and with firearms.
Yes.
Good photo. Nah, he's good in general. I really like him and his non-interventionist votes and everything. And yes, in general, I like the populist right. Personally, I'm more like, I consider myself more like a paleoconservative, but I really like paleolibertarian. So we are in the same boat.
Yes.
And also you have an interesting lecture about Zoomers. I think it was some years ago in the Mises Institute. And it seems that now that many Zoomers, the most periodic, probably the most attacked minority, are challenging long-standing political dogmas, especially regarding Israel, the size of government, and also the legacy of the Ron Paul revolution. How do you interpret this generational shift? Do you think this new wave could revitalize the libertarian or paleolibertarian movement? And also, here I have more questions. What do you think about Christian nationalists and the Groypers? Are they allies to libertarians? I'm not sure if you have seen Dave Smith interview with Nick Fuentes, but they seem to share a lot of common ground. As far as I know, the Groypers hold certain paleoconservative ideals such as non-interventionism, America First, and opposition to anti-Christian state policies. In fact, Nick Fuentes himself often mentions figures like Sam Francis and Pat Buchanan as influences. So what do you think about these topics in general?
Yeah. Well, I do think the Zoomer generation is a fascinating one. Because the title of my Mises U talk, which actually this year, it was about how the most persecuted minority. And I think particularly, so for one, our economic system is rigged. The youngest generation is always going to be worse off than the ones that came before it. And we've seen that. I mean, the boomers have done great. Generation X did worse. Millennials did worse than that. Zoomers are doing worse than millennials. This is the natural consequence of inflation and a number of things. And I think we need to say that, right? I think there's a big cultural, Rothbard wrote a great deal about class conflict, which has always been so baked into the classical liberal view of society that even Hoppe, Reiko, there's so much great scholarship about recognizing these inherent class conflicts. And I think there's definitely a generational conflict that is created by, particularly with the financialized world that we're in, and the financialized world was put into massive overdrive based off of the interventions of the Federal Reserve and pretty much all central banks after 2008. And so the generation that inherited most of that baggage has been Generation Z. We see it playing out with housing prices. We see it with the way that wage rates have not kept up with inflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, and then on top of that, so that's the economic side. On top of that, particularly the United States, there's been the amplification of the civil rights regime magnified itself in many ways. BLM, the Black Lives Matter kind of era there, certainly kind of put a massive highlight on it, where high school students that were told to stay in their rooms for 2 years, or a year at that point, were allowed to go protest in the streets against racism, right? And so, if you were if you're a Christian straight white man, in a Zoomer, you've grown up in a world where the government has stacked the deck against you in a significant way. It's true in college admissions, true in a variety of ways. Rothbard, in his critiques of the 90s, right, talked a great deal about the rise of this extremely discriminatory state against, particularly white Christian culture. And we've seen it only in overdrive. And so you combine those two elements of it, the the economic concerns and the cultural environment. And I think there is a demand for traditionalism. I think there's a demand for religion. There's a demand for something deeper than the sort of cultural liberalism that was so mainstream and sold to us in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. I think it's a fascinating phenomenon to see arise. Now, from that reaction is where you get, you've definitely seen it with the Groypers and Nick Fuentes. We've seen it with interest in Christian nationalism. We've seen this represented in a variety of very interesting political movements, the post-liberalism, if you will. I mean, there's a number of different shades, a number of different flavors in the right that attracts younger folks angry at the order that they were born into. And you can also see it on the left too. I mean, I think your millennial left, your Zoomer left wingers is far to the left of your average millennial. So you see it on both sides. And there's a desire for something deeper. And I think as libertarians, as people that oppose the regime, as people that recognize, if you hate the state, if you hate the current order, then these should be groups that you talk to, that you understand, and they try to educate. And I think obviously the biggest blind spot is economic policy, right? What they are railing, what they think that they are railing about when they talk about free markets or capitalism or libertarianism, whatever it is, right? We have cultural answers to these problems. It's not, our economic views is not simply what creates the most cheap stuff. The cheap stuff is a lot more important than, there is an importance there. But that's not the primary focus, right? And our focus isn't number go up, stock go up, right? All the sort of memes that you see when you see critiques of this sort of thing, all their superficial critiques are valid in the way that free markets and capitalism are defended by mainstream advocates of those things. But we recognize that we are advocating against the morality of a fiat dominated economic society. We recognize the valid grievances that different classes have. We recognize that labor is the most punished in this environment, right? So there's a number. So like their particular critiques of the status quo economically are all things that we also recognize, and that we need to be able to connect those two. That their critiques of the system is directed towards financialization, the financialized economy that we have right now. It's not against the free economy. But in order to have that conversation, you're not likely to have that conversation against someone who is seen as the enemy, someone who disregards your identity, disregards your culture, has a hostility to your values, right? And so I'm very glad to see someone like a Dave Smith be able to have a conversation with people like Nick Fuentes, because we need to have that dialogue. Now myself, I'm a millennial, so I don't consume a lot of Fuentes content. I do think that there is a problematic reaction to this cultural environment where it is this sort of elevation of Nazi aesthetics and the like, right? I think that that sort of taboo edginess. I don't think that is a smart thing, right? I think that is, it's not, I think that. I don't think that's good. I'm a fan of Ludwig von Mises. His opinions on his experiences with the Nazis are what they are. But I think that there's something real here, and the idea that we should just ignore them, that we should deplatform. If you do deplatform Nick Fuentes and pretend he doesn't exist, and that's going to just make it go away, I think that's absurd. I don't think that works, and so I think there's definitely something. And I think the Christian nationalism movement is very interesting. I think I've seen a lot of people that were libertarians back in the Ron Paul days attracted to that for their own reasons, and so I think that regardless of, it is not my belief that every Zoomer libertarian should be a Groyper, that every libertarian should be a Christian nationalist, that everyone should adopt, you should give up your libertarian interest and adopt these other views. That's not my view at all. But I think it would be a tragic mistake to not have communication there. And that's what Rothbard did in the 90s when he was, when you had the John Randolph Society, when you had Rothbard, on the same stage as Sam Francis, on the same stage as Pat Buchanan, when you had this mingling of the post-Cold War right having dialogues about cultural concerns, about economic concerns, things like that. So I think that sort of dialogue, I think the people that, and similarly, if you're a left libertarian, and I know a lot of them, some of them I assume are good people. I got a kid. There's left libertarians I respect. I'm happy when they reach out to like radical leftists. I wish them the best of luck. Murray Rothbard attempted to do the same thing in the late 60s, tapping into Vietnam War anger. Wish them the best. I'm not interested in doing it, but I wish them the best. I'm all in favor of dialogue so that we can try to identify that your grievances against the regime, the worst people, the ones that want to defend what currently exists for their own benefit. And so as long as we agree on, is the regime that exists right now good? Does it serve our interest? Is it a reasonable entity? If you think it is not a reasonable entity, those are people worth having conversations with. If they want to defend the institutions as they exist right now, then I think from a political standpoint, there's going to be limits there. To the extent that we can have institutional friendly Austrian scholars to try to mitigate some of the damages of economic policy, more power to them as well. But I think in terms of political movements, that really is kind of the underlying question. How much faith do you have the ability to fix the system as it currently exists? If you want to take a chainsaw to it, then I want to have that conversation, even if we disagree on other things. If you want to defend it, if you want to celebrate it, then we're probably not going to find a lot to agree with when it comes to political strategy.
Yes, personally, I like some left libertarians. For example, Kevin Carson. He's interesting at least in the finalization of economy, and also he's interested in his criticism about big companies. I personally like him in these things, but the ones I don't like so much are the post-liberals. I read Patrick Denen, and personally I didn't like him so much because he criticizes, for example, classical liberalism and everything like that. And then he defended social security. It's like, well, I mean, this is a consequence of, as for example, Paul Gottfried recalls, denaturalized liberalism is a consequence of this egalitarian democratic liberalism, but not especially classic, but also you defend this and you criticize first liberalism. I don't like him so much.
Yeah, I think the intellectuals that have this desire that, we can in the American experience, turn the FDR administrative state in our direction. I think that's at best a fool's errand, and at worst something very sinister. Now, I think that the 18, 19-year-old who reads Patrick Deneen is someone that is worth engaging with. Whether or not we can convince them to change their mind is a different question, right? But the person that is reading that is trying to think of is seeking something outside the box, even if what Deneen is having to offer is not particularly radical, right? And so that's the difference between trying to convert the intellectual that is fully pot committed to like adopting FDR, is accepting the FDR state at face value, versus the person who's just simply looking for something different. And I think that there's definitely two different categories there.
Yes, I agree. For example, I have some friends who are phalangists, like something like fascists, but in Spain. And personally, I agree with them in a lot of things, because sociologically we are very, very similar. They ask for big state, I disagree, but in general, we are like apart from the system. So personally, we have a good relationship. And okay, let's go to talk about local strategy. About Florida, I have one first question. What's your opinion on Governor Ron DeSantis? Because he was part of the Freedom Caucus, the most like far-right ones and populists, and he was good fighting liberals, but also he's excessively pro-Israel and not particularly libertarian when it comes to foreign policy. So what do you think about him?
Well, as a governor, I think he's been fantastic. He was what he did during COVID was extremely important, not just for Florida, but I think really the rest of the world. And in part, something important about that time was his willingness to take the civil rights regime that we live in seriously. And what I mean by that is that it was not simply him, pretty early on in the process, removing mask mandates or social distancing or any of the sort of early era interventions, right? It was him explicitly banning private vaccine restrictions, right? That as a business, you could force someone to wear a mask. As a business, you could force them to have a vaccine mandate, right? And this was something I remember debating Justin Amash on this question on Twitter at the time, because there is a very obvious libertarian disagreement there. Oh, well, the business owner has property rights. They should be able to discriminate against someone for not wearing a mask. They should be able to discriminate against someone who is not vaccinated. Therefore, this is an infringement upon their property rights. And my response is that they don't have property rights. Our legal system doesn't recognize property rights of businesses. In America, ever since the Civil Rights Act, you are restricted from discriminating against various types of classes. You can't discriminate by race and age and gender and et cetera, right? Now, again, I think that was a bad move. I think that that perverting our property system away from property rights to civil rights was a bad policy. I think it was an absolute coup against the existing constitution that existed. It was a massive infringement upon the traditions of our governing system. But I didn't get a say in that. This is what we live in, and so if you are selective in your defense of property rights, then what you're doing is creating a system where the only people you can discriminate against are people that question the regime, and that is bad. Like, it's bad. Where we can't, if you create a two-tier system where the people that care about property rights are going to be discriminated against, well, guess what? You're going to get a lot less property rights in society. The other side's going to win because you've skewed the game against them. And so that's where I think dealing with the world as it currently exists is extremely important. It's not, it's not always black and white answers when we're dealing with the massive interventions. Louis von Mises understood this, right? Rothbard understood this, is that, like, you can't just simply pretend away the state that currently exists when you're trying to decide what's the next best move in the short term. And so from that perspective, DeSantis on COVID was better than most libertarians. He was a better champion for liberty than most libertarians. Another great area he's had is higher education reform. Right, he has gone hard at if state universities are subsidized by state tax dollars, then guess what? Our state representatives are going to have a say in the makeup of these universities. We're not going to allow left-wing faculty members to have their own ability to govern themselves. No, we're going to come in. We're going to have tenure reform, so it's easier to fire people, and we're going to make sure that our university professors aren't riddled with Marxists that hate Floridians, because that would be I don't want my tax dollars going to pay for a Marxist. Now, I'd rather have a complete separation of state and college, but short of that, I want a university system that reflects the conservative dominance of Florida rather than have it dominated by Marxists. And so I think that's something that's extremely important. I think standing up to Disney with some of the stuff that they were doing, I think that was extremely important. And so when it comes to that state governing, and again, DeSantis very much using that strong executive power, he forced the legislature to do his COVID era policies. The business groups were going to fight against it. The state legislators were trying to act like Justin Amash and didn't want to do it. DeSantis made them bend the knee, and he got what he wanted done. He governed Florida like a king. And I would love to see more of that. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, there's a lot of foreign policy views I disagree with. I think that he immediately started backtracking when he was a candidate for president on some of those views. I think he paid a price for it. I think that's unfortunate. But if DeSantis would focus on being Florida, then I think DeSantis is at his best when he's governing Florida. I think at the national level, you have new different questions there. And so my hope is that Florida will continue to govern like it has the last 8 years. We shall see. We're going to have a big election next year, the new governor coming in there. But I think the most interesting aspect and what I expect to see more of is that COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement and a variety of these issues we've seen and it really kind of started in many ways with early left-wing victories on legal marijuana and gay marriage, is that we're seeing a lot more political migration within the states. That, if this was if this was 2008 and you wanted to smoke pot, I had a lot of people that moved to Colorado. If you wanted gay marriage, you could move to Massachusetts or you could move to San Francisco, right? During COVID, so many people came here because of our COVID policies. If you want your kid to go to a Florida school, you might move with them. And so my hope is that we'll see this trend continue, where we'll see a lot more differences at the state level, that we'll see a lot more political movement based off those political preferences. And so therefore, as crazy and as incompetent as Washington is, greater leadership at the state level will create a lot more diversity in political arrangements that will end up leading to better examples, better options in how we live our daily lives. And I think that'd be better off for everyone involved.
Okay. I think we don't have so much time, but for one question, I wanted to say that COVID was very important. Our first talk here was Philip Bagus, that he was very good in this topic. For example, he debated Walter Block, and obviously he won. And yes, our first talk was about the tyranny of COVID, because it was crazy. And
yes,
also Bolsonaro, he was very good internationally. Obviously, he was kicked out because of this mainly.
And the Biden administration didn't help that, but neither here nor there.
Yes, I know. And okay, the last question is more specifically about local politics, more local, because I understand that you have been involved in building networks in the Bay Area. What kind of initiatives of circles are emerging there to promote a paleolibertarian or right libertarian message? And within Florida's Republican Party, do you find an environment open or tolerant toward libertarian ideas, or is that still considered too fringe for mainstream Republican politics?
No, I think that at the local level, at least in the United States, you have a lot of practical decisions that local government engages with in terms of, how do we provide services the public expects? How do we protect certain areas? How do we build roads? There's a lot of these questions that they actually have decisions upon here at the local level. You're dealing directly with the decision makers, right? So you can actually, have conversations and learn, okay, what are the considerations that they're looking at? How do you make marginal advances to improve the quality of the way that government functions within your communities? Now, is the solution going to be, we'll just privatize everything? It's like, I've had a lot of people say, I wish I could privatize this. I wish I could privatize that. There's various reasons why. We have looked at, I know I've got a mayor here that I have elected that has moved towards reducing the number of government services and replacing it with like a grant system where the city will provide X amount of funding for a local organization that wants to provide this service and phase the government out of it, right? So I think that's a great example at a local level. But I think the important thing, though, is not going out there and saying, oh, well, I'm an anarchist and you're a bunch of statists and that's why you should listen to me, right? At local level, the opportunity is to influence and build networks. And one of the easiest ways to influence is by being the media. I know in the United States, local journalism, local news outlets are drying up. Most are incompetent. And so most people don't know what goes on at their local city commission or their county chamber, and so you have the opportunity to fill the void. You use social media instead of creating another libertarian podcast. You create a Facebook group, or you create an Instagram page, or you create a whatever. I would typically go with Facebook because your kind of main target audience is older people because they care about this stuff more than others. And you explain, okay, well, the city has these contracts out. Here's this corrupt contractor that's trying to do this. Here's this stupid thing they're trying to do, right? Here's the good thing you're trying to do. You simply do reporting. Here's what's voted on. Here's my economic analysis of why this is good, why this is bad, why that's in the middle, right? And you fill a void. You become the media. You become the local media. And when you start doing that, you have people following you and listening to you. And so all of a sudden, from your one voice, you start off with 20 people listening, and then you got 200 people listening. And all of a sudden, the local commissioner is going to want to talk to you because he needs those 200 people to vote for him. And so you build capital. You build political capital locally. And then all of a sudden, you know 3 people on a commission, right? You've got 3 friends on a commission of 5. If you think something needs to happen and you know your stuff, then you can get 3 votes, and then you can just do things, right? And that's what happens locally. You can't do it at the state level, right? You can't do that at the national level. The local level, you can do that. And then you find other people your age and you have conversations. So maybe it's maybe it's just having beers and talking about what's going on and talk unfiltered, right? And say things that would otherwise get you kicked off of social media, right? That's fun. Maybe it's giving talks and presentations, right? You get in young professionals who have never really thought about if taxation is theft, and you give talks, and they're like, oh, well, this is interesting. I've never thought about things that way, right? And so these are all sorts of things that you can do locally. It's much with very little money. It takes effort, but very little money, and in a short period of time. If you do that in a year, you're gonna have so much influence. Anyone can do this. You just need to care. You need to follow. You need to be open to knowing, to learning, right? You can't just go in assuming that you have all the solutions. You need to actually listen. But you can do this. And then all of a sudden you are an important person in your community. And it doesn't matter. You could be 20 years old. You could be, you could be 60 years old. You can be, you could have nothing more than a high school degree. You can be a PhD, but in your local level, you can matter. And I think focusing more on that instead of these broad, national ideological projects and the like, right? I think that's where a lot more time is better spent. Now, if you can raise millions of dollars, you can create an institution. If you can, build something like the Mises Institute, like Lou Rockwell did, then hey, more power to you. There's important, you need institutions of all sort, right? Yeah. We need national institutions, we need state institutions, but it's very hard to do that at a local level. Everyone can do this. And so that's, I think, is if you care about the process, if you care about politics and not just political theory, and if you do, that's fine. Again, I'm not telling anyone you have to be a political animal, but if you actually care about politics, this is a far better way of translating that into the real world in a way that matters than just, talking crap on Twitter.
Probably our listeners will like this last answer a lot. So, thanks for coming. We really liked it having you here, and probably we wanted to have you next time.
Sounds good. No, thanks for having me. Look forward to talking more.
Bye.